Right, so I've been asked to say a few words about the background to the Carbon Landscape project, and in particular why it was felt so important to work at a landscape scale. So I'd like to start off, if I may, by introducing the Great Manchester Wetlands, which is really the parent of the carbon landscape, our first child. So who are the Great Manchester Wetlands? Well, the usual people, partnership, local authorities, environmental charities and so on, but also businesses, both Peel and United Utilities are partners in Great Manchester Wetlands. So it's a fairly loose partnership, and not all of those partners are represented on the carbon landscape. So let's just have a look at some of the components that make up Great Manchester Wetlands. And this particular slide is very dear to my heart, because being so old as I am, I can remember going and visiting the Wigan Flashes in around about 1972. And if you think that slide on the left looks bad, I can tell you it looked an awful lot worse in 1972. And when I visited it, the water was bright orange, it was heavily polluted with sewage, and there were domestic tips on the side of it, and the rubbish was simply bulldozed into the flashes. So it really was pretty desolate, and it's hard to imagine anything further from a community asset. But and a dramatic reminder, really, of the devastation that was caused by the Industrial Revolution. But even at that time, I remember being quite shocked by what I saw, and I had seen quite a lot of polluted systems, but that was probably one of the worst that I'd ever seen. But as I was sort of taking it all in, I noticed that sitting on the bank of this bright orange water was an angler dangling his rod. And I thought, this is really a triumph of hope over adversity. But of course, if you look at it now, and there's loads of fish in Wigan's Flashes now, and there's all sorts of other things. And so it's really an example of not only what has been achieved, but the sort of thing that the carbon landscape and Great Manchester Wetlands are trying to achieve. So let's look a bit more about how it came about. And I think it's fair to give some credit to Natural England, or English Nature as they were then, who introduced a major initiative in 2008 called the Wetland Vision. And with that came a quite reasonable amount of money to actually buy up and restore wetland areas. And that enabled Lancashire Wildlife Trust, amongst others, to buy Caddy's Head moss in Salford, which was one of the first mosslands that we bought. Abram Flash and Lightshaw Meadows were also part of the purchases at that time. So this was a national programme, and I think one of the great things that this programme did was to actually articulate a vision for what Natural England and what collectively what the programme was trying to achieve. It was really trying to acknowledge the real benefits that wetlands can bring both to wildlife and the communities, and to provide some seed corn money to start to get the ball rolling. So that was a really good start. And then a couple of years later, John Lawton was asked to chair a commission and to produce a report called Making Space for Nature. And that's John Lawton, the second on the left. And he did really well. He produced a report, and quite remarkably, one of the recommendations of this report was to create 12 pilot nature improvement areas. And the remarkable thing is that the government at the time actually implemented that recommendation within 6 months of the report being completed, which is really quite extraordinary. And the kind of thing that Lawton was advocating in the report can be summed up in three words? 4 words, 5 words. Bigger, better, and more joined up. And that was what he was really trying to say. So bigger, he was saying, let's have bigger nature areas and let's have more of them. So the brown one at the top, I think, represents a new one. Better, let's improve the quality of the wetlands that we're managing. And let's do things like create a buffer zone around a mossland or other wetland area, and that will give more resilience to things like the impact of climate change. And let's allow wildlife to move from one area to another. And to do that, you have to start thinking not just of individual wildlife sites, but you have to start thinking of the whole thing as one big ecological network. And you have to work out how you're going to allow wildlife to move from one part to another. So one way of doing that is to actually create corridors, and the corridors might be hedges, they might be rows of fields. In the case of willow tits, they might be a string of individual trees, so long as they're less than 100 yards or 50 yards or something like that apart, because they're very fussy little birds. But that's the sort of thing that you've got to do. Or it could be creating stepping stones between sites. So that might be creating small bits of mossland with a reasonable spacing in between them. But the general idea is to create a coherent network. And that's what John Lawton set out to do. And so in order to get these 12 nature improvement areas, they had a competition. And there were around about 100 separate bids for the nature improvement areas. And the first step was to get it down to a short list of 20. And our project, with the Greater Manchester Wetland Project, succeeded in being one of those 20. But ultimately, it failed to become one of the 12. So we were a bit disappointed about that. We said, well, never mind, we'll carry on. We'd made perhaps a tactical error in submitting a project which was only 10,000 hectares when the limit was 50,000 hectares. But we wrongly thought that it would be better to have something which had really concentrated biodiversity in it. And the area is, in fact, the area that we submitted is very close to the area of the carbon landscape that you see today. But following the initial failure of that bid, we said, well, okay, what would we really like the area to be? And we blew it up, if you like, to that blue line that you see around the outside. And significantly, and I'll come back to this, you'll see that there's quite a big gap up there to the north, up to the M61, which is an area that we'd like to expand to in the future, and I'll say a bit more about that later. So that was the bid that we decided, never mind, we're not going to get any money. That's not going to stop us. And what we did was to carry on with the resources that we had got, and we applied to become one of the first locally designated nature improvement areas. So after 3 years, quite a number of the nature improvement areas actually stopped because their funding had stopped. But we've carried on, and we have a long-term perspective. We're there for the long haul, and we hope to continue to do that. So these are some of the key species that we're interested in. Water voles, I think everybody knows about the lovely cuddly water voles. And of course it's quite important to corridors for them, very important to have the right kind of habitat along rivers or ditches, mossland areas are really quite important areas for water voles. But this area, particularly important, as I'm sure you will know, for willow tits. And one of the key things you can do for willow tits, or one of the reasons why the area is a stronghold, is because, ironically, because there was so much neglected scrub woodland. And that similar stronghold for willow tits can be found over in the eastern side of the country, again in the aftermath of the coal fields, where you get these scrubby woodlands full of shopping trolleys and brambles, which everybody says we really need to tidy those up. And of course, if you do that, that's the worst possible thing for willow tits. So this is the kind of conflicts that we have to be aware of. Great crested newts, yes, everybody knows what, they need lots of ponds and wetland areas, and again, I'll come back to that with the area that I talked about. Large heath butterfly, well, sadly we haven't got the large heath butterfly in the area. It died out as the mosslands were erased, mainly for agricultural purposes, and later on for peat extraction. But again, I will come back to that. And the bittern, which is really working hard, struggling to get a foothold, coming back to Wigan flashes, which is one of the great successes. So, the carbon landscape. As you saw on that previous slide, there are three key areas: the flashes, Wigan flashes, large areas of water originally caused by mining subsidence, and as I say, being transformed from that previous desolate landscape of coal spoil and pulverised fly ash from power stations to this fantastic asset for the local community that we see today, but still needing lots of work. And one of the key projects in the carbon landscape is, of course, the fenscape. The mosslands, which to my mind are, in terms of their progression, maybe 20 years behind Wigan flashes. So Wigan flashes has sort of really gone from that desolation to something really pretty good in the last 50 years. Mosslands has only really seriously started that journey in the last 10 or 20 years. And to a lot of people, they still don't recognise or don't even know that they're there, even though there are substantial populations right on the borders of these mossland areas. And then down in the south, the Mersey Wetlands Corridor and Woolston Eyes, and you're going to hear more about that today. So those are the three quite distinctive areas that comprise the carbon landscape. And we submitted a bid under the Heritage Lottery Landscape Partnership Scheme. So it's very much looking at the two things that were really important to us. One, that we work at a landscape scale, and one, that we work in partnership. And the initial partnership was between, or the initial two key groups were the Wigan Greenheart partnership, which primarily looking after the flashes and other areas around Wigan, and the mosslands area. And those two areas together, broadly speaking, gave us the area that we were looking for. And then we added in the Mersey Wetlands Corridor as well, and that extended into Cheshire. So again, that was breaking the usual rules, because we were following the biodiversity, not following the administrative boundaries. And so that introduced Cheshire and Cheshire Wildlife Trust and Cheshire local authorities as well. But we obviously ultimately were successful, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. It took around about 3 years from start to finish to actually prepare the bid and get it concluded. So there was quite, it was quite a struggle at times. But the driving force behind it was that it was 5 minutes, good for carbon, wildlife, communities, and very much acknowledging the impact of those areas on people's health and well-being. And we're going to hear a lot more about that today, so I won't dwell on it. The Heritage Lottery money is split into 3 parts: people, community, and heritage. So only a third of the money, broadly speaking, is actually on restoration projects. And we're going to hear about a number of those projects today, so I won't go into further details. But just looking ahead, I mentioned the large heath butterfly, which used to be, it was a speciality of the area. So it actually had its own name, the Manchester Argus. And now that some of the mossland areas are in better condition and others are coming back into condition, we feel that there's a real possibility of reintroductions. So into the Cheshire Holcroft moss, for example, Astley moss on the northern side of the motorway, and possibly subsequently into Little Woolden moss. So that would be a fantastic step and a fantastic symbol of how progress is being made if we were able to do that. So this is very much hot off the press. It's not a project. It hasn't got any money, but you heard it here first. That's what we're going to do. We're going to reintroduce the large heath butterfly. And along with that, hopefully, and perhaps slightly easier to achieve, the white-faced darter, which is a dragonfly that is found certainly in Delamere Forest, but is no longer found in our area. Now, I talked about the need for reconnecting ecologically. One of the projects in the carbon landscape which I'm really pleased and excited about is the Carbon Trail, which is this physical trail linking up these elements of the carbon landscape for the community, and going all the way from Wigan down along the canal, down through the mosslands, and finishing up at Risley Moss. And so, as it happens, next Saturday it's being tested out. So anybody who's interested, I recommend that you go along to that. I said earlier that the Wetlands Vision, one of the key things that it did was to actually be able to articulate what it was trying to achieve. And I hope that Great Manchester Wetlands can also do that. By saying, what it's trying to achieve is a thriving, resilient and inspirational landscape. And I think that the carbon landscape is very much a part of that. So that's what it's trying to do. And and this question about benefits, not just for local communities, but for the local economy as well. So you can see how, for example, by bringing in more people, more tourists to the area, more visitors, and Wigan Flashes, you can see that happening. As I said, I hope that we can do that for the whole area. And this is my penultimate slide anyway. In the long term, we have the next project that we would like to see is probably, and again, no decision yet made, but very probably would be called the Pondscape, and would be aimed at the area north of the carbon landscape, going up to the motorway, sort of Cutacre and around that general area, which is relatively flat. It's got quite a number of ponds and is a stronghold for the great crested newt, but would be a lot more of a stronghold if it had a lot more ponds. So you can see the broad direction that we'd be going in is trying to encourage farmers, community groups, whoever we could persuade to dig more ponds, because we know that more ponds, more newts, and it's really as simple as that. From my own personal perspective, I would also hope that we can get back to chat moss, and having won the battle to stop peat extraction, which was a fantastic achievement really for the community, and there's no peat extraction now anywhere on chat moss. There were 3 separate peat extractions only a few years ago. So at the moment that particular site is lying idle and just waiting for somebody to come along and transform it into a fantastic wetland. So that's it, that's where we're going. And these are the people who are going to make it happen.